The morning I decided to forget my own name on purpose, I sat alone at my kitchen table in Morgantown, West Virginia, with a cup of black coffee going cold in front of me, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt absolutely, completely, terrifyingly calm. Not the calm of a woman who had given up. Not the calm of someone resigned to being victimized, or too tired to fight, or too old to matter. No. It was the calm of a woman who had finally, after 67 years on this earth, figured out exactly what she needed to do. And what I needed to do was disappear. Not for good, not forever, but just enough. Just long enough to see who would come circling while they thought I wasn't watching. Here is what you need to know before I tell you anything else. I am not confused. I have never been confused. Every single morning since I was a little girl growing up in a coal miner's family in Fayette County, I have woken up knowing exactly who I am, where I am, and what I need to do to get through the day. That has never, not once in 67 years, changed. But the people closest to me, the people sitting at my dinner table calling me honey and mama and Aunt Dottie, had started to tell a very different story. They whispered it to each other in hallways when they thought I couldn't hear. They said it in hushed voices on the phone, spelling out words the way you do around small children. They brought it up with my doctor. They brought it up with my bank. They brought it up with one another, over and over, building it brick by brick like a wall I was never meant to climb over. They said I was losing my mind. And the truly breathtaking part, the part that still fills me with a cold, precise fury when I think about it, is that I only discovered what they were saying because I was sharp enough to notice the smallest details. The nervous looks exchanged across tables, the way conversations stopped the moment I entered rooms, the questions that were not quite questions, posed in gentle tones that were meant to sound caring, but felt like fingers testing the lock on a door. So I gave them what they wanted. I performed the confusion they had already decided was true. I let my eyes go a little blank at the right moments. I repeated myself. I misplaced things deliberately. I called people by the wrong names. And then I sat back, perfectly, quietly, devastatingly lucid, and I watched every single one of them show me exactly who they really were. What I saw broke my heart. It also set me free. Before I go any further, I want to take just a moment right here because this story, the one you're about to hear, is one of the most important things I have ever shared. If you found this channel, if something in that title spoke to you, if you've ever felt like someone was trying to make you smaller than you are, then you are exactly who I made this for. This content is completely free, and every single story here is real. If this matters to you, please take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel and ring that bell so you never miss another story like this one. Hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it means the world to this community. And please, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me where in this country or this world you're watching from. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber helps this channel reach more women like us, women who need to hear that it is never too late to take your life back. Thank you. Now let me tell you everything. My name is Dorothy Eugenia Halstead, and I was born on March 4th, 1957, in a 2-room house on Crab Creek Road outside of Oak Hill, West Virginia. Most people called me Dottie from the time I was old enough to respond to my own name, and that's what I'll go by here, because that is who I am. Not Dorothy, the formal name on legal documents, but Dottie, the woman who raised 2 kids on a teacher's aide salary, grew tomatoes in a backyard plot the size of a parking space, and never once missed a PTA meeting or a church potluck in 32 years. I tell you where I come from because where you come from in West Virginia is not just geography. It's a whole orientation toward life. My father, Raymond Halstead, worked the coal mines for 26 years. My mother, Vera Jean, worked the way women of her generation worked, without a title, without a paycheck, without a day off. They raised 4 children in that little house, and they taught us three things above all else. You work for what you have, you do not ask for what you have not earned, and you do not let anyone take from you what is rightfully yours. I did not fully understand the third lesson until I was 67 years old. Growing up in Fayette County in the 1960s was not easy, but it had a texture to it that I have never found anywhere else. The hills were so green in summer, they almost hurt your eyes. The air in the morning smelled like creek water and wood smoke. Everybody knew everybody, which meant everybody knew your business. But it also meant that when something happened to you, a death, an illness, a crop that didn't come in, people showed up at your door with casseroles and firewood and a willingness to sit with you in the hard parts. We were poor by most measures, but we were not alone. That distinction mattered enormously. I was the second of 4 children. My older sister, Lena, was born in 1954 and was, from the time I can remember, the organized one. The one who kept lists, remembered birthdays, balanced the family checkbook before she was 14. My younger brother, Dale, came along in 1960, followed by our youngest sister, Carol Ann, in 1963. We were a tight unit, the 4 of us, pressed together by circumstance and genuine affection in equal measure. We shared beds, shared clothes, shared the single bathroom in the house, and came out of childhood with the kind of bond that you can only build through that kind of sustained closeness. I was a decent student, not brilliant, not struggling, just steady. I liked reading more than anything. My 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Elkins, noticed and used to slip me library books that weren't on the assigned list, wrapped in brown paper like they were something contraband. She was the first adult outside my family who looked at me and seemed to see something worth paying attention to. I have never forgotten her for that. After high school, I did not go to college. That was not a realistic option for a family like mine in 1975. What I did instead was marry Gerald Halstead. No relation, just a coincidence that made everybody laugh at our wedding, when I was 20 years old. Gerald was 23, the son of a hardware store owner from Beckley, good-natured and steadfast in the way that quiet men often are. He was not a man of grand gestures. He did not bring me flowers unless I specifically requested them, and even then, he'd bring whatever was in the gas station bucket by the register. But he worked hard. He came home every evening. He never raised his hand or his voice in anger, and he was genuinely delighted by our children in a way that still makes me soft when I think about it. We had 2 children. Our son, Marcus, was born in 1979, when I was 22. Our daughter, Renata, came along 3 years later in 1982. Those were tight years financially. Gerald was working at an auto body shop in Morgantown by then, and I had picked up part-time work as a teacher's aide at the elementary school 2 miles from our house. We drove a 1974 Ford pickup that needed a new alternator every 18 months and heated the house with a wood stove we'd bought secondhand from a family who was moving to Ohio. We were not comfortable, but we were not afraid. There is a difference. Gerald died in 2011. A heart attack, sudden and total, in the parking lot of the Kroger on Greenbag Road. He was 54 years old. He had gone to pick up the ingredients for the beef stew I'd asked him to make that Sunday, and he never came back inside. The paramedics said it was fast. I have held on to that detail like a handhold on a cliff face. The fact that it was fast, that he didn't suffer, that the last thing he was doing was something ordinary and domestic and kind. I was 54 years old when Gerald died. I was not a woman who crumbled. I cried until I couldn't anymore, and then I got up and kept going, because that is what you do when you come from where I come from and you have children watching. Marcus was 32 by then, already married to his wife Paulette, already living in Charleston. Renata was 29, still in Morgantown, working as a dental hygienist. They both rallied around me in the immediate aftermath the way I would have expected them to, and I was grateful. What I did not anticipate, what I could not have anticipated, was how the years after Gerald's death would slowly rearrange the landscape of my family in ways I would not recognize until it was almost too late. By the time I reached 62, I had retired from my teacher's aide position after 31 years. I was collecting Gerald's pension from his years at the Monongalia County Maintenance Department. He'd left the auto body shop in 1988 for a government job with benefits, one of the smarter decisions he ever made, and I had my own small pension from the school district plus Social Security. Combined, I was bringing in approximately $100 a month, which in Morgantown in 2019 was enough to live on with care. I owned my house free and clear. Gerald and I had paid off the mortgage in 2007, 4 years before he died. It was the thing he was most proud of, that paid-off house. I also had savings. Not a fortune by any measurement, but real, accumulated, hard-won savings, approximately $74,000 sitting in a money market account at a credit union in town. Money I had added to steadily over 30 years, $5 here and $20 there, the way working-class people build wealth when wealth is not handed to them. That money represented something beyond its dollar amount to me. It represented every shift I had worked, every vacation I had not taken, every impulse purchase I had talked myself out of. It was proof that I had been prudent and consistent and forward-thinking for my entire adult life. It was that money, combined with the monthly income from my 2 pensions and Social Security, that would eventually make me a target in my own family. But I am getting ahead of myself. The signs came slowly. They always do. For the first several years after my retirement, I was genuinely quietly content in a way that surprised me. I had imagined that leaving the school would feel like a loss. 31 years is a long time to spend anywhere, but instead, it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for longer than I had realized. I planted a bigger garden. I started attending a weekly quilting circle at the First Methodist Church on Spruce Street. A group of 8 women between the ages of 60 and 80 who met every Thursday morning and solved most of the world's problems over fabric squares and coffee cake. I read everything I had never had time to read. I drove to Charleston to see Marcus and Paulette and their 2 daughters, my granddaughters Bree and Sylvie, at least once a month. I felt, for the first time in perhaps my entire adult life, like I was living at a pace that matched who I actually was. Renata was the one I saw most often, living as she did only 4 miles from my house. She stopped by 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more. She had not married, had come close once in her early 30s, a man named Kevin whom I had liked considerably, but that had not worked out. And though she had a full life with friends and her work and her hobbies, there was a proximity between us that I treasured. We watched television together on Friday nights. We went to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings in the summer. She was the one who drove me to my annual cardiology checkup after I had a small arrhythmia scare in 2018 that turned out to be nothing serious, just something to monitor. Marcus I saw less of, which was simply geography and the demands of his life. He and Paulette had built something in Charleston, a comfortable life, a nice house in a good neighborhood, the girls in good schools. He worked in pharmaceutical sales and traveled frequently. When he called, which was reliably every Sunday evening, we talked for 20 minutes and covered the important things: the grandchildren, my health, the news, the state of the house. He was attentive in the way of a person who has organized their attentiveness carefully, which is to say, it was real but scheduled. What I did not understand in those early retirement years was the way things were quietly shifting underneath the surface of my family. I was watching the life I could see. I was not watching the conversations I could not hear. The first sign came in the spring of 2020, when the world had gone strange with the pandemic, and we were all, like everyone else, trying to adjust to a reality that felt provisional and disorienting. I was 63 years old. The sign was small enough that I nearly missed it entirely, and when I look back on it now, I am still struck by how ordinary it seemed at the time. It was a Sunday afternoon in late April. Renata had come over to help me set up the video call program on my laptop so that I could join the virtual quilting group that Mrs. Patricia Obery, Patty, who had organized our Thursday circles for 11 years, was attempting to organize for those of us who couldn't meet in person. While Renata was at my laptop, leaning over the keyboard with that focused expression she gets when she is concentrating, her cell phone rang on the kitchen table. She didn't answer it, but I saw the screen light up and I saw the name on it. Marcus. That was not unusual. What was unusual was what happened next. About 40 minutes later, after Renata had successfully gotten me set up on the video platform, and we'd had coffee, and she'd gone home, I went to the kitchen to refill my cup and found her phone still on my table. She had forgotten it. I picked it up to call her so she'd know, and the screen lit up again. She must have gotten a notification, and I saw, without intending to, the beginning of a text thread. The preview showed 4 words before the screen locked. She seemed confused again. I set the phone down. I made my coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at my yard for a long time. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that Renata was probably talking about something entirely different. A coworker, a neighbor, someone at church. I told myself that even if she had been talking about me, noticing confusion in an aging parent was not a crime. And perhaps I had seemed confused about something I couldn't remember. I had been tired. The pandemic was disorienting for everyone. I let it go. I was not as good at letting things go as I believed myself to be. The second sign came 6 weeks later, in early June of 2020. By then, Renata was dropping off groceries at my door twice a week because she was insisting I not go to the store myself due to my age and what she called your heart thing, referring to the arrhythmia situation from 2 years prior that my cardiologist had told me, in plain and unambiguous language, required only annual monitoring and no restrictions on activity. I had pointed this out to Renata at the time she'd started the grocery arrangement, and she had nodded and said, "I know, Mama, but just to be safe," in a tone that did not invite further discussion. On a Thursday morning, she knocked at my door with 2 bags of groceries and her friend Stacy, whom I had known for about 6 years, a pleasant woman who worked with Renata at the dental office. Stacy had come along, Renata explained, because she was helping out. I thought nothing of this and invited them both in. While I was putting the groceries away, I heard them in the living room talking quietly. I was not trying to eavesdrop. My house is small and sound carries easily, and I have always had sharp ears. What I heard was not a full conversation, just a fragment, Stacy's voice saying something about keeping an eye on things, and Renata saying in a low voice that had a quality I could only describe as conspiratorial, "I know. I'm working on it." Working on what? I did not know. When I came back into the living room, carrying 3 glasses of sweet tea, both of them looked up at me with bright, slightly too wide smiles. The kind of smiles people put on quickly when they have just stopped talking about something they don't want you to know about. My stomach had gone tight in a way that I recognized from a long life of paying attention. But what was I going to do? Accuse my daughter and her friend of talking about me based on a fragment of overheard conversation and a smile that seemed a little too practiced? I was a reasonable woman. I had no evidence of anything. I smiled back and asked Stacy about her mother, who had been having knee trouble. I rationalized it the way I had rationalized the text preview. Stress, the pandemic, overcaution from a daughter who loved me and perhaps worried more than was warranted. I was 63 years old and had a minor monitored cardiac irregularity. Of course, Renata worried. That was what devoted children did. I was giving everyone far too much credit. The third sign arrived in August of 2020, and this one was harder to rationalize, though I managed it. I had called my bank, Miners and Merchants Credit Union, where I had banked since 1983, to ask about the interest rate on my money market account, because I had seen an advertisement for a CD that offered a slightly better rate, and I was considering moving a portion of my savings. This was a perfectly routine financial inquiry, the kind I had been making independently for 40 years. The woman who answered, a young teller named Keisha, whom I had spoken to on several previous occasions, was her usual friendly self. But when I asked my question about the money market rate, she paused in a way that felt slightly too long, and then said in a careful voice, "Mrs. Halstead, I do see a notation on your account." Would you like me to connect you with someone in account services who can help you with any changes? I asked her what the notation said. Another pause. It's just a flag for, it says to confirm identity on account changes and to contact the secondary authorized party. I asked her who the secondary authorized party was. A very long pause. It shows a Renata Halstead-Briggs. I thanked Keisha calmly, told her I did not need account services, asked for the current rate on my money market account, which she gave me, and ended the call. Then I sat in my kitchen chair for approximately 20 minutes without moving. Renata had put herself on my bank account, or had attempted to, or had requested some kind of authority over it, without telling me, without asking me, without any conversation whatsoever. I drove to the credit union the next morning and spoke with the branch manager, a man named Carl Westover, whom I had known for 15 years. Carl told me, with visible discomfort, that my daughter had come in 3 weeks prior and explained that her mother was experiencing cognitive issues and that she was concerned about the account. She had not been able to gain full joint access without my signature, but she had successfully requested a notification flag on my account so that any changes I attempted would trigger a call to her. I sat across from Carl Westover's desk and felt the specific cold fury of a woman who has just discovered that someone has gone around her. I was calm. I was polite. I told Carl to remove the flag from my account immediately, which he did. I told him that I was in full possession of my cognitive faculties and that if anyone attempted to access my account information without my explicit, in-person authorization, I expected the credit union to refuse. He agreed, apologetically, and I believed him. I told myself, driving home, that there was a reasonable explanation. That Renata had been frightened by something, a moment she had misinterpreted, some behavior she'd found worrying, and had overreacted in a way that was misguided but not malicious. I did not call her about it. I did not confront her. Looking back now, I understand that my unwillingness to confront was itself a kind of information. I was not ready yet to know what I would find if I looked directly at it. The fourth sign came in the winter, December of 2020, at a family dinner that Marcus and Paulette drove up from Charleston to attend. It was the first time we'd all been together in months, and I had spent 2 days cooking brisket, green bean casserole, sweet potato pie, cornbread, in the way that I cook for people I love, which is excessively and with great attention. The house smelled wonderful. The girls, Bree and Sylvie, ran through the rooms, being 9 and 6 respectively, and it filled me with the particular joy that grandchildren bring, which is the joy of watching your bloodline be joyful. After dinner, when Paulette had taken the girls into the living room to watch a Christmas movie and I was washing dishes in the kitchen, I heard Marcus and Renata in the dining room behind me. Their voices were low. My back was to them and the water was running, but I had turned the faucet down lower than I needed to. I realize now that I had been doing this instinctively for months, the act of a woman whose body knew something her conscious mind was still resisting. I heard Marcus say, "How long do you think before she can't manage the house?" I heard Renata say, "I don't know, maybe a year, maybe sooner, the way things are going." I heard Marcus say something I couldn't catch, and then Renata's voice again, clearer. "We need to be thinking about power of attorney before it gets harder to get her to sign anything." I turned off the water. I dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. I walked to the doorway of the dining room and looked at my 2 children, who looked back at me with that half-second of frozen guilt that people cannot suppress when they know they have been caught. "The pie is in the warmer, if anyone wants a second piece," I said. I went back to the dishes. My hands were completely steady. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, I sat in Gerald's old armchair in the living room, the brown recliner he'd had since 1998 that I had never been able to get rid of, and I allowed myself, for the first time, to consider the possibility that what was happening was not a series of misunderstandings and overreactions. I considered the possibility that my children, my own children, whom I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, were constructing a narrative about my mental decline, deliberately and cooperatively, with specific goals in mind. The thought was so painful that I got up, washed my face, and went to bed. I was not ready yet. But the thought was in me now, and it did not leave. The fifth sign came in February of 2021. My sister Lena, who lived in Beckley, called me on a Tuesday morning to chat, as she did every week or so. We talked about the usual things, her grandchildren, my garden plans for the spring, a documentary series she'd been watching. Then, toward the end of the call, she said something that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. "Dottie," she said, in the careful tone of a woman delivering something she'd been rehearsing, "I want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you can always come stay with Bud and me in Beckley. We've got the spare room." I told her I appreciated that and asked what had prompted the offer. A pause. "Well, Renata called me last week. She said she's been worried about you, said you've been having some trouble with things, memory things." "Lena," I said, "what exactly did Renata tell you?" Another pause, longer. "She said you'd left the stove on twice, that you'd called her by the wrong name once or twice, that you'd gotten confused at the grocery store." Lena's voice was gentle and sorry, the voice of someone who doesn't want to say what she's saying. "I'm not saying I believe all of it, Dottie. She was worried, and she called me, and I thought you should know she called." I thanked my sister for telling me. I told her I was fine and that we would talk soon. I hung up the phone. Renata had called Lena. She was building a record, not just within our immediate family, not just with my bank, but outward, into the wider circle of people who knew me and loved me. She was laying groundwork. The question was, groundwork for what? The sixth sign answered that question, and it was the one that made everything finally terribly clear. In March of 2021, I received a letter from a law office in Morgantown, Caulfield and Associates, a firm I had never dealt with, informing me that my daughter, Renata Halstead Briggs, had initiated a consultation regarding guardianship proceedings. The letter was addressed to me, which I found ironic, given that the entire premise of guardianship is that the subject is too impaired to manage their own affairs. The letter explained, in formal language that could not quite disguise the violence of what it was saying, that if I wished to contest any such proceedings, I had the right to retain counsel. I read the letter 3 times. I set it on the kitchen table. I got up and made tea. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the February bare branches of the maple tree in my backyard move in the cold wind. The sky was the flat gray color it gets in March in West Virginia, heavy and low. I was 64 years old. I had never been diagnosed with any cognitive condition. I had never failed a mental status test. Not that anyone had ever administered one to me. I had a monitored cardiac arrhythmia that my cardiologist described as mild. I paid my own bills. I managed my own medications. I drove myself everywhere. I read a book a week. I grew my own tomatoes. And my daughter was attempting to have herself declared my legal guardian. The reasons were not mysterious to me once I allowed myself to see them clearly. As my legal guardian, Renata would control my finances, my $74,000 in savings, my 2 monthly pensions totaling approximately $200, my Social Security, my house, which had been appraised in 2019 at $187,000. If she could establish, through the record she had been carefully, patiently, systematically building with my bank, my sister, and apparently her own observations that I was cognitively impaired, she could gain legal control of everything Gerald and I had spent our lives building. I sat at that kitchen table for a very long time, alone in my small, clean house in Morgantown, and I allowed the full weight of that to settle into me. And then, somewhere underneath the grief and the fury and the disbelief, I felt something else begin to grow. Something quiet and focused and cold. Something that felt, if I am being honest, a little bit like my father, Raymond Halstead, looking up from the mine floor and deciding he was not going to let the mountain fall on him today. I set the letter from Caulfield and Associates face down on the table. I picked up my phone. I called my doctor's office and made an appointment for the following week. Not because I was worried about my mind, because I needed documentation. And then I started to plan. The greatest tension I felt in those days was not the fury. Fury I could manage, fury was clean and focused and useful. The greatest tension was the loneliness of knowing and not being able to tell anyone. I had no one in my immediate circle who was not potentially compromised. Renata was the architect of the situation. Marcus, I now suspected, was involved to some degree. The conversation I had overheard at Christmas had not been the murmurings of a concerned son, but the logistics of a coordinated effort. Lena had been recruited, however innocently, to be a witness to my supposed decline. My friends at the quilting circle were lovely women, but I did not know how to begin to have this conversation with them without sounding precisely like someone who was having paranoid episodes. That isolation was deliberate, I realized. It was part of the design. When you systematically undermine a person's credibility with everyone around them before anything official happens, you ensure that person has no one to turn to when the official process begins. It is a clean and efficient cruelty. I spent 2 weeks doing nothing but thinking. I went about my life exactly as I always had. Garden planning, quilting circle, Friday night television. And I thought. I thought while I cooked. I thought while I drove. I thought while I lay in Gerald's half of the bed in the dark with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling I had looked at for 41 years. What I understood, after 2 weeks of thinking, was this. I could hire a lawyer and contest the guardianship proceedings directly. This would be expensive. Attorneys in Morgantown were not cheap, and it would require me to publicly and formally dispute my own daughter, which would be ugly and painful and would generate exactly the kind of family conflict that tends, in my experience, to leave everyone permanently damaged. It would also alert Renata and Marcus that I was not as impaired as they had decided, which would change their behavior and potentially cause them to accelerate whatever timeline they were working on. Or I could give them exactly what they were looking for. I could become the confused, declining, vulnerable woman they had already decided I was. I could inhabit that role so completely and so convincingly that they would relax their vigilance, show me their full hand, and in doing so, give me everything I needed to not just defend myself, but to document, incontrovertibly, what they had been doing. It was not an easy decision. It required me to be someone I was not. It required me to perform a diminishment of myself that went against every instinct I had. It required me to let people treat me as less than I was, and to hold still for it, and to keep my face neutral and my eyes soft and empty while they did. But I had come from a coal miner's family, and I knew something about keeping still in the dark and waiting. The first thing I did was make an appointment with Dr. Angela Ferris, my primary care physician, and explain the situation to her plainly and privately. Angela Ferris was a small, precise woman in her late 40s who had been my doctor for 11 years and who had, to her considerable credit, never once talked to me as though my age made me less capable of understanding information about my own body. I trusted her completely. I sat in her examination room and I told her everything. The text preview on Renata's phone, the bank flag, the overheard conversation at Christmas, the call to Lena, the letter from Caulfield and Associates. I watched Angela's expression go from attentive to carefully controlled as I spoke, which in my experience is what a good doctor looks like when they are managing their reaction to something that angers them. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dottie, I want to do a full cognitive assessment today. Everything. The MMSE, the MOCA, the clock drawing, the whole battery. I want it documented and dated and in your file, and I want you to have a copy." I agreed immediately. She administered the tests herself, right there in the exam room, and when she was finished, she told me, with a directness I appreciated, that my scores were well within the normal range for a woman of 64, and that she was noting in my file that I had presented with no signs of cognitive impairment. She also noted that I had presented the history of the situation clearly and logically and in significant detail, which she said she was including specifically because it spoke directly to my capacity. I'm also going to give you a referral to a neurologist for a second independent assessment, she said, for the same reason, documentation. I thanked her. I asked her one more thing, whether she had received any calls or inquiries from my family about my cognitive status. She paused, a doctor pause, careful and measured. I'm not able to discuss the specifics of any communications with third parties, she said, and then, but I will say this. If someone contacts this office making unsubstantiated claims about a patient's capacity, that contact is logged, and it can be subpoenaed. I understood her exactly. I saw the neurologist, Dr. Rashid Okonkwo, at Mon Health Medical Center 2 weeks later. He was thorough and kind and told me, after a 90-minute evaluation, that I was cognitively normal by every measure and that he was documenting this finding comprehensively. He also told me, gently but directly, that he saw patients in situations like mine more often than people would believe. That elder financial abuse was one of the fastest growing categories of crime in the country. That the perpetrators were, statistically, overwhelmingly family members. I knew this was meant to be informative. It felt like being handed a map just as you realize you are already lost. I retained an attorney. Her name was Helen Pruitt, and she was 61 years old and had practiced elder law in Morgantown for 27 years and had a handshake that could crack walnuts. I found her through a legal aid referral that Angela Ferris had quietly slipped me on a business card at the end of my appointment. Helen listened to everything I had to say and then told me I had every right to contest any guardianship petition, that the medical documentation I had already obtained was excellent, and that she was going to help me build the strongest possible defense. Then I told her the second part of my plan. Helen Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very carefully, "Tell me more." I told her. I told her about giving them what they expected, performing the decline, inhabiting the role, letting them show me exactly who they were and what they intended while I remained, underneath it all, entirely clear-headed and entirely prepared. I told her I wanted to document everything, the conversations, the actions, the decisions made in my name without my consent. I told her I wanted to catch them, not just planning, but acting. Helen studied me for a long moment. "This isn't a game, Dottie," she said. "No," I agreed. "It isn't. If you do this incorrectly, if you say or sign something while in this role that can be used against you, it could complicate things." "I'm not going to sign anything," I said. "I'm not going to change any accounts or make any legal decisions while we're doing this. I'm just going to act confused. And when they take actions based on my supposed confusion, documented actions, recorded actions, we're going to have everything we need." Helen tapped her pen against her legal pad for a moment. "I want a clear protocol," she said. "Rules for what you will and won't do. Written down. Agreed to by both of us before this starts." "Agreed," I said. We spent the better part of that afternoon creating the protocol. I would perform cognitive confusion in my manner and speech, repeating things, seeming to lose track of conversations, appearing to forget details. I would not make any financial decisions, sign any documents, or agree to any legal arrangements while in this role. I would carry a small digital recorder, legally permissible in West Virginia for one-party consent, at all times when interacting with Renata, Marcus, or any third party they might bring into the situation. I would take handwritten notes immediately after every significant interaction. I would report to Helen weekly by phone. Helen also did something I had not thought to ask for. She sent a certified letter to Caulfield and Associates, informing them that I had retained legal counsel and was aware of any proceedings. This, she explained, would slow them down considerably. They would now have to go through proper legal channels rather than catching me unaware. It would also, she said, likely prompt Renata and Marcus to change their approach, possibly becoming more personal and direct in their pressure. Good, I said. That's exactly what I want. I drove home from Helen Pruitt's office on a gray afternoon in late March of 2021, and I sat in my driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The maple tree in the backyard was just beginning to bud, tiny reddish-green leaves starting to uncurl after the winter. Gerald had planted that tree the spring after we'd paid off the mortgage as a kind of celebration. He'd planted it too close to the house, and I'd told him so, and he'd said the house would be fine and the tree would be beautiful, and he'd been right on both counts. I went inside. I fed my cat, a gray tabby named Franklin, who had been with me for 6 years, and who greeted me every evening with the cautious enthusiasm of an animal who has learned not to expect too much from the world. I heated up leftover soup. I ate at the kitchen table with Franklin on my lap, and I looked at the kitchen where I had cooked 10,000 meals and raised 2 children and had my heart broken and put myself back together. And I felt something settle in me that I can only describe as readiness. I was going to forget my own name. I was going to let my eyes go blank at strategic moments. I was going to call Renata by my sister Lena's name occasionally, and then catch myself with a confused little frown. I was going to leave a pot on the stove once or twice, turned off, but left there as if I'd forgotten it. I was going to be, in every visible way, the woman they had already decided I was. And then I was going to watch them try to take everything I had built. And then I was going to take it all back. I want you to understand something about the performance of confusion, because it is not as simple as it sounds. There is a temptation, when you are a sharp woman playing at being less sharp, to overdo it, to be so dramatically confused that you tip your hand, to stagger around making obvious mistakes that no one would believe were accidental. That kind of performance would have destroyed the whole plan within a week. What I needed to do was much more subtle. I needed to produce the kinds of errors that genuinely worried families actually report about genuinely declining loved ones. Not dramatic, cinematic confusion, not wandering in the yard at night or forgetting what a fork was, but the quiet, almost imperceptible slippage that makes a family member exchange a look across a dinner table that accumulates over time into a pattern that feels just alarming enough to justify the concern they'd already decided to feel. I spent a week before I started observing myself, really observing myself the way an actress studies a role. I noticed what I did automatically, how I moved through my kitchen, how I organized my thoughts when speaking, how I navigated familiar routes in conversations. Then I systematically introduced small distortions into each of those things. Not enough to be clearly fake, just enough to register. I started in early April of 2021. Renata came over on a Wednesday afternoon, which she did most weeks, and I let her find me standing in the hallway, looking at the linen closet with a small, bewildered expression, as if I had opened it looking for something I could no longer recall. She asked what I was looking for, and I said, "Oh, I'm not sure. I was just..." and let the sentence drift away into nothing. I watched her face carefully from the corner of my eye. She went very still for a moment, the way people go still when something confirms what they already feared. I felt sick about it. I want to be honest about that. The performance cost me something real, every single time I did it, because I am not naturally a person who deceives the people I love, even people who are trying to steal from me. Even then, it cost me. But I held the picture of Gerald's pension in my mind, and I held the picture of my savings account and my paid-off house and my paid-off life, and I kept going. 2 weeks into the performance, Renata started calling more frequently. She dropped by on days she usually didn't come. She started asking during these visits very specific questions. What did I eat today? Had I taken my medications? Did I remember what day it was? I answered these with varying degrees of apparent accuracy, sometimes getting the day of the week slightly wrong, sometimes having to think hard about what I'd eaten. The recorder in my cardigan pocket was small and warm and completely invisible. It captured everything. Marcus called me on a Sunday evening, as he always did, but the quality of the calls changed. There were more questions embedded in what sounded like casual conversation. "What did the doctor say at my last appointment?" I told him I had seen Dr. Ferris recently, which was true, and gave vague details about the visit, which were not. He asked if I was managing my bills all right, and I said, with a little laugh that I calibrated to sound uncertain, that I was trying to keep track of everything. He was quiet after that, in a way that told me he had heard exactly what he needed to hear. In late April, Renata brought someone to my house I had not met before, a woman she introduced as a social worker named Janet, who was visiting as part of a county senior wellness program. I had done enough research by then to know that this was either a real program or a fabricated pretext, and either way it was designed to produce an informal assessment of my capacity. I was ready for her. I was friendly and warm with Janet, and confused in the specific ways I had practiced. I forgot what I'd told her 2 minutes before about my medication schedule. I called Renata Lena once, and then corrected myself with that little frown. I left the room to get Janet a glass of water and came back with a coffee mug, looked at it with genuine seeming bewilderment and said, "Now I don't know what I was doing." Janet's face did the thing that told me she had noted this. The recorder in my pocket noted Janet. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote everything down, dated and timed, in the spiral notebook I had designated for this purpose and was keeping locked in the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. Then I called Helen Pruitt and left a message reporting the visit. The momentum was building. I could feel it, the way you feel weather changing before you can see it. They were moving faster now, emboldened by what they believed they were seeing. And I was, underneath my careful performance of confusion, absolutely awake. If you're watching this and you're feeling something rise up in your chest right now, that heat, that indignation, that I would have done the same thing feeling, hit that like button right now, would you? It truly matters, and it helps this community reach every woman who needs to hear this story. The moment I had been waiting for came on a Saturday morning in early May of 2021. I had been performing my role for approximately 5 weeks. I was 64 years old, and I was sitting in my living room with a cup of tea and a library book, a habit I had maintained for 30 years regardless of whatever else was happening in my life, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. Then 2 cars. I stayed in my chair. I kept my face soft and open, the way I had practiced. I heard keys in the door. Renata had a key, had always had a key, which under normal circumstances I would never have thought twice about. And then the sound of the door opening and footsteps in the entryway and Renata's voice calling my name. "In here," I said, in the mildly confused way I had been cultivating, the tone of someone who is not quite sure where here is. Renata came into the living room, and behind her came Marcus. And behind Marcus came a man in a dark jacket who was carrying a soft leather briefcase. He was perhaps 45 years old, with the careful appearance of someone in a professional capacity, a lawyer, or a financial advisor, or some combination of both. I looked at the man with what I intended to appear as curious blankness. Renata sat down on the couch across from me. Marcus sat beside her. The man with the briefcase took the armchair to my left, which had been Gerald's chair, a detail that, in the moment, I had to actively suppress from my expression. "Mama," Renata said, in the gentle, slightly elevated tone that people use with the very young and the very confused. "You remember we talked about getting some things organized, some paperwork?" I did not remember because it had not happened, but I nodded slowly, with a frown that suggested I was working hard to retrieve a memory. "This is Mr. Dalton," she continued. "He's been helping us, helping our family, think through some planning, some financial planning, for your future." Mr. Dalton smiled at me. It was a professional smile, practiced and smooth, and it told me nothing about him except that he was good at his job. "Mrs. Halstead," he said, "it's wonderful to meet you. Renata and Marcus have told me so much about you." He reached into his briefcase and produced a folder, which he set on the coffee table in front of me. "We just have some simple documents today, nothing complicated, just some arrangements that will make things easier for your family to help you." He opened the folder and turned it to face me. The top document was a durable power of attorney form. My daughter's name was already filled in as the designated agent. The lines for my signature were marked with red, sticky arrows. I looked at the document. I let my face remain open and slightly perplexed. I picked it up with both hands and tilted my head as if reading it, though what I was actually doing was memorizing the document number, the law firm name at the top, and every detail I could catalog quickly. The recorder in the pocket of my housecoat was running. "Now, this just means that Renata can help you with things," Mr. Dalton said. "Banking, bills, that sort of thing. When you need a little help." I looked up at him. I looked at Renata. I looked at Marcus. Marcus was watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, or perhaps had seen and not permitted myself to name. It was the expression of someone waiting for something to happen that they need to happen. It was not the expression of a son who loved his mother. It was the expression of a man managing a transaction. That look, more than anything else that had happened in the preceding months, clarified everything for me in a single cold second. I set the document down. I put both hands in my lap, and I said, in the mildly uncertain voice I had been practicing, "I think maybe I should talk to my doctor first. Before I sign anything, I always talk to Dr. Ferris about things." Mr. Dalton's smile shifted almost imperceptibly. "Of course," he said. "That's very wise. There's no rush." But there was. I could see it in the glances that passed between Renata and Marcus. There was absolutely a rush. Something had prompted this visit today specifically. Some deadline or court date or consultation I was not aware of. And the fact that I had deflected, even so gently, had disrupted a plan that expected less resistance. "Mama," Renata said, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees and her voice dropping to that very gentle register, "we just want to make sure you're taken care of. That's all. We love you." "I know," I said. And I patted her hand, and the recorder in my pocket captured every syllable. They left 20 minutes later, taking the folder with them. Mr. Dalton gave me his business card, which I accepted with a vague smile and set on the end table. After the cars had pulled out of the driveway, and I had heard them drive away down the street, I sat alone in my living room, in the house where I had lived for 40 years, and I breathed for a full minute before I moved. Then I picked up the business card. Then I picked up the phone and called Helen Pruitt. "They came today," I said when she answered. A pause. "With documents?" "With a durable power of attorney, already drafted. My daughter's name as agent, signed by a man named Dalton from what I think is Caulfield and Associates." Helen was quiet for 3 seconds. "Did you sign anything?" "Of course not," I said, in my perfectly clear, perfectly focused, perfectly intact voice. "I told them I wanted to talk to my doctor first." Another pause, and then Helen Pruitt said something I had not heard her say before. "Good girl." What happened after that Saturday in May moved quickly, though the weeks leading up to it felt anything but quick. I want to try to convey to you what those weeks were like from the inside, because I think it is important that you understand the full shape of what I did and what it cost me, not just the outcome. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from sustained performance. It is not physical exhaustion, though it has physical symptoms. A tightness in the jaw from maintaining controlled expressions. A sensitivity in the ears from constant listening. It is a deeper kind of tiredness. The tiredness of existing in 2 states simultaneously. The visible state, which is confused and diminished and passive, and the real state, which is calculating and vigilant and burning with a cold, steady fire. I also had to manage the emotional weight of what I was learning about my children. Every encounter confirmed it further. Renata called every day now, sometimes twice, and the calls had a checking quality that I recognized. She was monitoring me, assessing, building her record. Marcus called his usual Sunday evenings but had begun, subtly, to ask questions about my house maintenance, whether I had gotten the gutters cleaned, whether the water heater was still running properly. These were not the questions of a son concerned about his mother's comfort. They were the questions of a man taking inventory. I called my sister Lena from my car one afternoon, parked in the lot behind the library where I went 3 times a week as part of my normal routine. I had thought carefully about this call. Lena had been recruited by Renata, but Lena had also been the one to tell me about that recruitment, which told me that her loyalties were not entirely realigned. I told Lena plainly, in my fully clear voice, what was happening. I told her about the bank flag, about the social worker visit, about Mr. Dalton and the documents. Lena was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Oh, Dottie, just that." 2 words, in the voice of a woman who is horrified and sorry and realizing she has been used. "I need you to remember this conversation," I said, "if it ever comes to that. I need you to remember that I called you from the library parking lot and I was clear and coherent and I told you what was happening." "I'll remember," Lena said. "I swear to God I'll remember every word." That was the alliance I needed. The one person in the outer circle who had been brought in against me and who, when confronted with the truth, chose me. Helen Pruitt was working on multiple tracks simultaneously. She had sent a second letter to Caulfield and Associates, formally placing them on notice that I was contesting any guardianship petition and that I was represented by counsel. She had subpoenaed the bank records, which showed the timeline of Renata's attempts to access and restrict my account. She had been in contact with Dr. Ferris's office, and the documentation from both my primary care assessment and Dr. Okonkwo's neurological evaluation was now formally entered into the legal record. She was also, and this is the part that I found most satisfying in a cold and precise way, quietly investigating Mr. Dalton. His full name was Gregory Dalton, and he was not, as it turned out, employed by Caulfield and Associates. He was an independent financial planning consultant with a specialty in what he called, on his website, elder wealth management and family transition planning. Helen's investigation had found 2 prior complaints against him with the West Virginia State Bar Association, neither of which had resulted in formal discipline, but both of which described a similar pattern. A family member concerned about an aging relative brings Dalton in to facilitate the transfer of assets under the guise of care planning. Dalton drafts documents, collects his fee, and walks away. It happens all the time. It happens so often that there is a word for it in the elder law community, and the word is predatory. "He's not the primary person we're going after," Helen told me, "but he's going to be a very useful character in the story we're going to tell." The recordings I had been making were extraordinary evidence. Over 6 weeks of documented interactions I had captured. Renata telling Stacy that the process was moving forward. Marcus telling Renata on a speakerphone call that I had accidentally included in a recording that she seems worse, which is good. Mr. Dalton explaining to Renata and Marcus before they brought him into my living room that he had reviewed my financial profile and that the assets were significant enough to warrant a clean legal arrangement as soon as possible. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My son said that my apparent decline was good. My son. Because it served the timeline, because it moved them closer to what they wanted. I had one more thing I needed to do before the plan reached its culmination. I needed to document formally and clearly that the money they were attempting to access was mine and mine alone, that it had been accumulated by me and Gerald over decades of work, that it had never been shared with, promised to, or designated for either of my children. Helen helped me draft a detailed affidavit of financial history, signed and notarized, covering every account, every asset, every pension, its origin, its current status, and its intended disposition under the will Gerald and I had executed in 2009. Then Helen and I scheduled a meeting, not with each other, with Renata and Marcus. Helen sent the invitation through formal channels, a letter to both of them, advising them that their mother's legal representative wished to meet with them to discuss matters related to their mother's estate and capacity. The meeting was set for a Friday morning in June of 2021 at Helen's office in downtown Morgantown. I know Renata called Helen's office twice between receiving the letter and the meeting date, trying to get information about what it was regarding. Helen's assistant told her, politely and each time, that the meeting agenda would be covered at the meeting. I spent the week before the meeting being, for the first time in 2 months, entirely and openly myself. I called my quilting circle friends and had coffee with Patty Obery at her kitchen table and laughed genuinely and talked about the garden I was planning for summer. I walked to the library by myself. I cooked elaborate dinners and ate them at my own table with Franklin in my lap and the evening news on the television, and felt the comfort of my own life around me, like something restored. On Thursday evening, I took out the blue blazer I had bought at Penny's in 2018 for my nephew's college graduation and hadn't worn since. I pressed it carefully. I set out my good black slacks and my pearl earrings, real pearls, a gift from Gerald for our 30th anniversary in 2007. I polished my black loafers. I had been performing Confusion for 2 months. On Friday morning, I was going to be, in every visible and audible and legal way, the clearest woman in the room. The morning of the meeting, I was up before 5. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table in the early quiet and let the house be around me. The birds were already starting outside. The first week of June in West Virginia is a symphony if you're willing to listen. And the light was coming up slow and gold over the hill behind the neighbor's house. Franklin sat on the chair across from me and blinked his yellow eyes at me with the serene lack of concern that cats bring to human drama. I thought about Gerald. I thought about the day he'd carried me over the threshold of this house in 1980, both of us laughing because he'd banged my hip on the doorframe and then lost his footing on the threshold mat, and we'd both nearly gone down on the entryway floor. I thought about the mortgage payment book we'd kept in the kitchen drawer and the way I'd cross off each month's payment with a red pen, a ritual I'd started as a joke and maintained for 27 years because the crossing off felt like something. I thought about raising Marcus and Renata in these rooms, the particular chaos and joy of it, the homework at the kitchen table, and the arguments about curfew and the quiet Sunday mornings when we all just existed together without any agenda. I was not going to lose this. I was not going to lose any of it. Not to a power of attorney drafted in bad faith. Not to a guardianship proceeding built on fabricated evidence. Not to a son who thought my decline was useful and a daughter who had looked at her mother's life savings and seen opportunity. I showered and dressed and drove myself to Helen Pruitt's office on High Street, arriving 10 minutes before the scheduled time. Helen was already there, at her conference table, with 2 legal pads and a neat stack of folders and the kind of focused calm that comes from 27 years of doing this work well. "You ready?" she said when I came in. "I've been ready for months," I said. Renata and Marcus arrived 3 minutes late, together in Marcus's car, which meant they had driven up from Charleston together or met somewhere to drive together, which meant they had coordinated this, which meant they had expected this meeting to be something manageable that they could handle as a united front. They stopped in the doorway of the conference room when they saw me. I watched their faces. I watched the way Marcus processed my expression, my clear, direct, fully present expression, and did not understand it yet. I watched Renata's eyes move from my face to Helen's face to the stack of folders and back to my face. I did not perform confusion. I did not look vague or soft. I sat in my chair with my back straight and my hands folded on the table, and I looked at my children with an expression that I had not shown them in 2 months, my real face. "Sit down," Helen said. They sat. Marcus was on Renata's right. They both looked suddenly younger than their years, not in a flattering way, but in the way that adults look young when they are frightened and do not yet know whether to be frightened, Helen began. She laid out, in the organized and precise way of an experienced attorney, what she had. The bank flag and its removal, the documented attempts to access my financial accounts, the visit from the county social worker who had no documented affiliation with any county senior wellness program, the visit from Gregory Dalton with the already drafted power of attorney. The recordings, she mentioned the recordings specifically, and watched both of my children's faces change. She presented the two independent cognitive assessments, Dr. Ferris's notation, Dr. Okonkwo's neurological evaluation. She presented the letter from Caulfield and Associates and the formal contesting of any guardianship proceedings. Then she put a single sheet of paper in the center of the table. It was a printed summary of the recordings and their contents, with timestamps and a notation of the West Virginia one-party consent statute that made them entirely legal. Your mother, Helen said, looking at Marcus and Renata in turn, has been in complete possession of her cognitive faculties throughout every interaction you believed you were documenting as evidence of her decline. She has been aware of your actions since March of this year. Everything you said in her presence, and several things you said within her hearing when you believed she was not listening, has been documented. The silence in that conference room had a quality I cannot fully describe. It was the silence of two people having the floor taken out from under them. Marcus's jaw was tight. Renata had gone the color of old chalk. What we are offering, Helen continued, is a resolution that does not involve criminal prosecution. She let that sit for a moment. Elder financial abuse is a felony in West Virginia. Your mother has grounds to pursue charges against both of you, as well as against Gregory Dalton. She has chosen, as of this moment, not to do so. What she is asking for instead is the following. Helen slid a second document across the table, a simple, signed, and notarized agreement. I would not pursue criminal charges provided all attempts to access my financial accounts ceased immediately and permanently. The guardianship petition, if formally filed, was voluntarily withdrawn. Both Marcus and Renata signed acknowledgments that I was cognitively competent and that their prior characterizations of my capacity had been incorrect. Gregory Dalton's name was reported to the West Virginia State Bar Association by both of them, in writing with a full account of his involvement. Your mother's attorney will hold copies of all documented evidence indefinitely, Helen said. If any future action is taken against your mother's financial assets or legal autonomy, that evidence will be forwarded to the Monongalia County Prosecutor's Office immediately. Renata started crying halfway through Helen's reading of the agreement. Not dramatic sobbing, just the quiet, uncontrolled tears of someone who has been caught. Marcus was very still, the way Marcus had always been still when he was processing something he did not want to be true. I looked at my daughter. I had loved her from the moment she arrived, a red-faced, furious newborn at Mon General Hospital in November of 1982, and I loved her still, even then, even in that room, with all of it laid out between us. That is the particular anguish of being a parent betrayed by a child. The love does not stop. It just coexists with everything else, which is its own kind of suffering. Mama, Renata said, in a voice that was almost unrecognizable. I'm sorry. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about what to say. I thought about all the things I could say. The anger, the grief, the litany of specific betrayals. I thought about Gerald in the parking lot of the Kroger, and how he had not gotten to say goodbye, and how I had held everything together after that without asking anyone for anything. I thought about my father crossing off the mortgage payments with his red pen, all those years ago, at his own kitchen table. I know you are, I said. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply the truth, and the truth was complicated, and I was done performing anything other than what was real. Both of them signed the agreement that morning, every item. Marcus signed with the focused, slightly jerky signature of a man doing something he hates. Renata signed and then put her hands over her face for a moment and then put them back in her lap. Helen collected both signatures. I signed my own copies and received mine. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 14 minutes. Then Helen showed them out, and I sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes while she saw them to the elevator, and I looked at the framed photograph on Helen's wall, a mountain lake, very blue, very still, and I breathed. It was over, and it was not over. Those two things were both true at once. The weeks and months that followed the meeting at Helen's office were not simple. Anyone who tells you that resolution brings immediate peace is giving you a story with the complicated parts removed. In the immediate aftermath, I dealt with the practical things, because practical things have the virtue of being concrete and actionable, and therefore manageable. I went back to Miners and Merchants Credit Union and had a full account review with Carl Westover, who was visibly relieved to see me come in clear-headed and with my attorney's contact information on a card I handed him. I updated my beneficiary designations on every account, not to remove my children, but to formalize and document what had always been my intention, so that nothing could be ambiguous. I reviewed my will with Helen and made 2 amendments that clarified the disposition of the house and the larger savings account. I called Caulfield and Associates myself, not to threaten, not to negotiate, but to make clear that I was aware they had been involved and that I was watching. The attorney who had initiated contact with Renata, a man named Barrett Caulfield Jr., whose voice had the careful smoothness of someone unaccustomed to being held accountable, told me that his firm had been working from information provided by my family and had acted in good faith. I told him I understood his position. I told him that if any paperwork bearing my name was ever generated by his firm without my direct and in-person request, I would file a formal complaint with the West Virginia State Bar. He understood my position. Gregory Dalton received written complaints from both Marcus and Renata, as agreed. I do not know what became of those complaints specifically, but Helen told me 6 months later that Dalton's elder wealth management consulting practice had gone quiet. He was no longer appearing at the senior centers and church events where he had previously been marketing his services. Sometimes accountability works slowly and sideways. Sometimes that is enough. The relationship with my children was the part that did not resolve cleanly, because it could not. Some things break and do not reassemble into the same shape, and the shape of my relationship with Renata and Marcus after June of 2021 was necessarily different from anything before. With Marcus, I want to be honest. Things were and have remained cool in a way that I do not think will fully warm. He lives his life in Charleston. He calls on Sunday evenings, as he has always done, and we cover the grandchildren and the news and the basic architecture of family obligation. He has never, in all the months and the year that has passed since the meeting, said anything more to me than, "I'm sorry, Mom." And he said that once, briefly, on a phone call 2 weeks afterward. I accepted it and moved on because I am not interested in prolonged self-flagellation from my son, and because I have enough grief in my life without manufacturing more of it. Bree and Sylvie, his daughters, remained my grandchildren in every way that mattered. I drove to Charleston for Bree's 10th birthday in November and brought her the quilt I had been making for her, blue and yellow, her favorite colors, and held her while she told me about her school play, and the love I had for that little girl was as clean and whole as anything I have ever felt. Children do not bear the weight of their parents' choices. I made sure mine never felt mine. With Renata, things were harder and also more possible. Renata lived 4 miles from me. Renata had been, before all of this, the person I was closest to in the world after Gerald died. The distance between what we had been and what we now were was a specific, palpable loss that I experienced not in a single dramatic moment but daily in small ways. The Thursday nights I used to look forward to, the farmers' market Saturdays, the easy intimacy of a mother and daughter who had been genuinely close. I did not shut the door entirely. I also did not open it all the way. What Renata had done was not a momentary lapse of judgment. It was months of sustained, deliberate effort to take something from me. Whatever was driving that, financial desperation I hadn't known about, some distorted logic about protecting me that had metastasized into predation, or simply greed dressed up in the costume of concern, I could not simply overlook it. I was not built for that kind of forgiveness, not yet, and possibly not ever. What I could do was leave the door unlocked. Renata knew where I lived. She knew my number. She knew because I told her directly in a phone call the week after the meeting that I was willing to have a relationship with her that was honest. Not a relationship in which we pretended the previous months had not happened. Not a relationship in which she got credit for good intentions she had not had. But a real relationship between two people who knew each other's full nature, if she wanted that. She called, slowly, then more regularly. We started meeting at the farmer's market again on occasional Saturdays, and we were careful with each other in the way of people who have learned that carefulness is necessary. It was not what we had before. I will not pretend it was. But it was something real, and real, in my experience, is worth more than performed. In the fall of 2021, I joined a new group at the First Methodist Church, not the quilting circle, though I continued that too, but an advocacy group for elder rights that had been organized by a woman named Beverly Tanner, who was 68 and had been through her own version of what I had been through, except that she hadn't caught it in time and had lost money before she understood what was happening. Beverly was fierce and funny and deeply committed to the idea that what had happened to both of us should happen to fewer women, and I was immediately and completely on board with that goal. We started meeting monthly. We brought in speakers. Helen Pruitt came twice. Dr. Okonkwo came once. A detective from the Morgantown Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit came and told us things about elder financial abuse that should have been on the front page of every newspaper in the country. We talked to women in our congregation, in our neighborhoods, in our family networks. We made a list of the warning signs, not the ones designed to spot cognitive decline, but the ones designed to spot the people exploiting it. I told my story. Not once, not twice, many times, to many different audiences. The first time I told it in front of a group at a Thursday evening gathering at the church, I was frankly terrified, which I mention because I want you to understand that being strong and being frightened are not opposites. I had been frightened from the moment I saw that text preview on Renata's phone, and I was frightened still, sometimes, at 2 a.m., when the house was quiet and the old griefs came visiting. But being frightened had not stopped me. I would not let it stop me from speaking either. The responses I got from women in those groups, and later from women I connected with through Beverly's expanding network, changed something in me in a way I did not entirely anticipate. I had expected to feel useful. I did feel useful. But more than that, I felt seen. Seen in the specific way that only happens when you tell a true story to someone who recognizes it. The number of women in that room who had experienced some version of what I had described, the number of women who looked at me with their eyes bright and their jaws set and said, "That happened to me. That almost happened to me. That's happening to my neighbor right now." It was staggering, and it was galvanizing. I took a class at West Virginia University's Extension program in the fall of 2021, a 12-week course on financial literacy for seniors, offered free of charge, taught by a retired accountant named Mr. Garvey, who was 81 years old and the most organized human being I had ever encountered. I already knew most of the material, but taking the class formalized my knowledge and connected me with 15 other women my age who were trying to understand and protect their own financial situations. 3 of those women joined Beverly's advocacy group. My garden that summer was the best I had ever grown. I don't know how to explain why, except to say that there is something about a period of sustained internal tension that once it releases, causes everything in you to bloom. I had tomatoes that August the size of baseballs, deep red and warm from the sun, and I stood in the backyard and ate one straight off the vine, juice running down my wrist, and I felt something so uncomplicated and so right that it brought tears to my eyes. Franklin, my gray cat, turned 7 that fall and had become more affectionate than ever, which I chose to interpret as solidarity. By the winter of 2021, I had begun, quietly, privately, with no particular destination in mind, to write things down. Not a diary exactly, something more deliberate. I was writing about what had happened, but also about what I had learned from it, about the specific mechanics of how elder financial abuse is constructed and how it can be dismantled, about the particular experience of being a woman who has been underestimated and who has used that underestimation as a strategic advantage. I didn't know what it would become. I still don't know for certain, but the writing felt necessary and right, and so I kept doing it. I am, at 67 years old, exactly who I have always been. I am Dorothy Eugenia Halstead, Dottie to everyone who knows me, born on Crab Creek Road outside Oak Hill in the year of Eisenhower's second term, raised in a coal miner's family in Fayette County, educated by a 5th-grade teacher who wrapped library books in brown paper, married for 31 years to a man who planted a tree too close to the house and was right about it. Mother of 2 children I love, with the complicated love of a woman who knows them fully. Grandmother of 2 little girls I love, with the uncomplicated love that skips a generation. I own my house. I manage my own money. I read a book a week. I grow tomatoes. I go to Quilting Circle on Thursday mornings and to Beverly's advocacy meetings on alternating Tuesdays, and to Dr. Ferris's office once a year for a full checkup that continues to find nothing worth worrying about. I call Lena every Sunday after church. I am awake, alert, and paying attention, and I plan to remain all 3 for as long as I am breathing. And if anyone ever tries again to mistake my quietness for vacancy, my patience for confusion, my care for weakness, I am prepared. I have always been prepared. I just know it better now. If you have made it here with me to the end of this story, I want to say something directly to you. What happened to me was not unique. Elder financial abuse is one of the most underreported and underaddressed crimes in this country, and the vast majority of it is committed not by strangers, but by family members, caregivers, and trusted advisors. It happens in living rooms and at kitchen tables, over cups of coffee, and in well-lit law offices, in whispered phone calls, and carefully constructed narratives. It happens to sharp women and sharp men who are reduced, in the minds of people who want what they have, to obstacles to be managed. Here is what I want you to take from my story. Know your accounts. Know the numbers. Know the names on them. Know who has access and who does not. Know your rights as an account holder and as a citizen and as a competent adult human being who has every legal right to control what belongs to you. Do not assume that love inoculates people against greed. Do not assume that family loyalty is unconditional. Do not assume that because someone has always been trustworthy, they always will be. Assumptions are what predators count on. If something feels wrong, if a relationship is shifting in ways that don't make sense, if questions are being asked that weren't asked before, if you are being characterized in ways that don't match your own experience of yourself, pay attention, write it down, date it. Talk to someone outside the situation. You are not imagining things. You are not paranoid. You are a woman whose instincts have been sharpened by a lifetime of paying attention. And those instincts are worth trusting. And if you are ever in a position where someone is trying to convince the world that you are less than you are, please know this. The fact that they need to diminish you in order to defeat you is the most eloquent possible testimony to how powerful you actually are. They cannot take what they want from you while you are standing. They need you on your knees first. Stand up. Stay standing. It is never too late to refuse to be erased. It is never too late to document, to plan, to find allies, to find counsel, to build the case that proves what you have known all along, that you are here, you are present, you are capable, and you are not going anywhere. My father, Raymond Halstead, worked the mines for 26 years and came up every single day. My mother, Vera Jean, worked without a title or a paycheck and never once lost count of what was hers. I am their daughter, and I am standing in the house I own, in the life I built, with the savings I accumulated and the pensions I earned and the cat on my lap and the tomatoes in the backyard, and I am telling you, they did not take a single thing from me. Not one thing. Before I let you go, if this story meant something to you, if it made you feel something true, if it made you think of someone you know who needed to hear it, please give it a like right now, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that bell so the next story finds you before you have to go looking for it. Leave me a comment below and tell me what moved you most, and tell me what part of this country or this world you're watching from tonight. Every one of those actions costs you nothing and helps this channel reach more women who are sitting alone somewhere, wondering if what they're feeling is real. It is real. They need to hear that. Help me find them. This story is dedicated to every woman who was told she was too old, too confused, too soft, too much, or not enough, and who proved, quietly and completely, that she was none of those things. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves out there, and don't let anyone take what's yours. With love from Morgantown.